a big weather story this morning. Bright red sky first thing with that awesome looking sunrise. Now we Good morning. Now we're official. I always wonder, like that first minute when it comes on, the like before when I pause it, if I'm doing something like if I'm saying bad words, I don't ever do that actually. Or I'm usually watching the news, so hopefully there's no weird part of the news that gets broadcast. As class begins. Excuse me. So, morning. Hope everything is well. Hope your house is warmer than mine. Oh, crud, I turned on the heater, but it's not plugged in. You're supposed to unplug the heater before you. Yeah, okay. All right. And you're supposed to plug it back in when you use it. All right. So, we're going to talk about some history stuff. I'm also going to mention to you that I'm slowly grading your work. I'll be done either tonight or tomorrow. So, if you have any questions or concerns, hopefully I'll put some comments in there that are useful. I did notice, and of course I don't remember whose it is, and I have no idea how to fix it, I'll be honest with you. But one of you turned in your work in one of my least favorite ways, which is not your fault at all, because I don't understand, how it works on your end. But when you turn it in, whoever did this, and I put a note in there, it's like, oh my gosh, you have to try to fix this. But you put it in and it just scrolls all the way across one line. So like I have to keep scrolling and scrolling and scrolling. And then I can't find the rubric for about 2 minutes and stuff. So I can't read your whole answer while I'm grading it. So I don't have any clue why that happens. So I don't know. I don't know why it happened. So I'm just telling you it did. So if there's anything you can do to fix it, try something a little different. But I know it could be hard for you because if I can't tell you why it happened, you may not figure it out either. So no pressure, really. I mean, it'll just be easier for me to grade, but not that big a deal. All right, and hopefully everything's going well for you guys. And we've got a quiz next week. This week you just have the one weekly question. So, life is easy this week. And next week I don't think it'll be so bad, but quizzes won't take too long. I think there's typically 20 questions. I've made the quiz, but I haven't typed it into your form yet. So I'll do that this week. And I'm feel confident it'll be 20 questions. Sometimes it's 16, but I think yours will probably be 20. So, and in the past, when people have had opinions about how long the quiz should be, part of the reason they like for it to be 20 is each question's worth fewer points. So if you miss them, you don't feel quite as bad about missing them. Also remember that there is a list of things to study for the quiz. I think it's just called time question review or quiz review. And also, if you got a grade you really dislike, apologies if that happened, on your first question, because I think I'm done with everybody's first question. Why are so many weird things coming up in my screen sharing? Sorry. If you didn't get as many points as you want in that first question and my notes aren't helpful, look at the sample answer in the course documents. All right, I'm going to ask a question. You ready? Can you see the weekly questions today? Oh no, those are the weekly question comments. You don't want to see those. Oh my gosh. Okay. I saved the comments, so I'll look back and go like, did I tell the kids that or not? I know. That's really weird, isn't it? Now I feel bad that I showed you the weekly question comment. Let me find the weekly questions. That would be so much better. There we go. Okay. Oh dear. At least I don't save the comments by name. That would be much worse. Sorry. Okay. Weekly questions. All right. I feel like you can see the weekly questions. Doesn't look like comments, so that's good. Okay. All right. So this week's question is how and why tobacco planters in the Chesapeake region came to rely on African slaves for the on rather than European indentured servants over the course of the 17th century. At what point did the Chesapeake become a slave society rather than a society with slaves? One of the things that you'll definitely want to mention in this discussion would be Bacon's Rebellion. So I'm telling you right up front, if your answer does not talk about Bacon's Rebellion, I'm going to think, oh, little pesky kid, why did they not write about Bacon's Rebellion? I'll probably think some other stuff too, like how come they don't pay attention during class? My lectures are so interesting. But be sure that you write about Bacon's Rebellion. And magically enough, we'll talk about that here today or Thursday or probably both. Okay. All right. All right. Let me see if I can find the notes without posting all of your personal information or that looks like the weekly questions again, doesn't it? Goodness. I'm the worst in the morning. I don't know if I'm any better in the afternoon. Dang. Fine. One more try. Weekly question. Now it's completely gone. You know what? We're just not going to have class. No, I'm going to open it again. It's going to work. Okay. I'm going to stop being whiny. All right. One more try. Goodness. Okay. This looks promising. Oh, gosh. Okay. There we go. Goodness. Adam Smith. Adam Smith. It's a good place to start. Maybe that'll get me back on track. Oh, my goodness. Okay. So we talked about all the little dot. I'm so sorry. All the little dot things from last time. So I was trying to impress on you that the Puritans were probably better than we think of them in historical memory. But you know, that Salem witch trial thing, that was bad. And I can't remember if it was this class or I think it was the afternoon class because they were more awake. Or maybe I was more awake. I'm not blaming you. It's probably me. And I was telling them, you know, the witch trial, the witch execution thing was more of a problem in Europe than it was in the United States. And they go like, okay, well, how many people were killed in Europe? And then we looked it up and it was something like over 50,000. So they were much more serious about their witch trial thing in Europe than we were in the United States. Oh, goodness, I'm so sorry. And my glass of water is probably not going to wake me up, but I'll try. But so healthy, right? Okay, so Adam Smith. Adam Smith, you remember we talked about him, and he said that the colonization of the Americas was one of the most important events, or probably the most important event in history, which might be a little biased, and I don't know how you'd ever decide what the most important event in history was, except Adam Smith, he knew. He also will coin the term mercantilism. Mercantilism is really kind of the economic story of early America, which, you know, kind of matters because if the American colonies, US, what becomes US, had not been profitable, then people probably wouldn't have come over here and colonized. So making money, you know, whether you are like strong capitalist or you're democratic socialist or you're somewhere in between, which is where most people probably are, you always have to have money to pay the bills. That's just kind of the way the world works. So people didn't come over like just to see the sights or to explore, you know. So mercantilism is the idea that the mother country should control the colonial trade for the benefit of the mother country, not the colonies. So you know, they're not necessarily suggesting that it's okay to mistreat people, although they have moments. But they are saying that the goal of the colony is not to make the colonists' life better, but to improve the economy of the mother country. Now, one of the things that's quite a bit different about this early colonization, exploration, however you want to look at it, is a lot of people from the home country, primarily England, of course, are moving over and they are used to having the rights of citizens because not everybody who came over was poor. You know, if you came over and you became a landowner, you clearly had landowner. I noticed that kind of slid out. You came over and were a landowner. You were used to having rights. So you're kind of an upper class person. You're used to playing some role in how you're governed. So you don't feel like a colonist. You feel like you're an English citizen, just, west, what, yeah, west of England. So you're just like citizen, but citizen west of England. So you don't feel like your rights should be restricted. And typically a colony is run as a place that's other. It's not really us. It's a place that we sort of took over, but they're not our people, so we don't care about them in the same way. We don't want to give them rights or extend lots of courtesy or governance to them, self-governance. So it's going to create an issue for people who are from England or used to English tradition and are now being limited in their rights in some ways. Now, this didn't happen immediately, of course, as you know. At first, really the English just kind of leave the colonies alone. As long as they're making money, it's like, yeah, we don't care. Just bring in some cash and we'll be good. All right. So, but this will eventually lead to trade restrictions on enumerated items. Enumerated items is just kind of a fancy way of saying a list. So when you enumerate something, you just say it or list it. So, so the English will eventually list some items that have to be taxed if you trade them. And they're going to include important stuff to British folks like tea. Manufactured goods, like stuff made out of metal, because honestly, there's not a whole lot of metallurgy going on in the Americas. So if they can tax the American colonists a little more heavily on that stuff, they don't have anywhere else they can get it, except maybe France. And then they'll start to limit French trade, of course. And sugar, of course, is the big money maker. And I forgot tobacco going back, of course. Okay. So sugar and tobacco are the big cash crops. But you've studied world history, which I know you have. You know that the sugar trade is really what drives the traffic back and forth between the Americas and Europe. And of course, it's what leads to that global impact of slavery. It's where you see more slaves going to the areas where they're growing sugar. Now, that is not to say, and you'll notice as we go through the class, we're certainly not going to minimize the impact of slavery in the United States. It's a big deal. It's a larger, like statistically or numerically, more slaves go elsewhere in the Americas. And that's just to say that. It's not to say good, bad, and, I'm just saying. Okay. All right. And the reason is that the sugar crop is just so much more of a moneymaker. All right. The English will take over New Amsterdam. And we talked about how that was a growing trade colony and people kind of liked the Dutch because they're super fair and they really weren't very nationalistic. They weren't trying to take over the colony or the land so much in the same way that the English and maybe the French a little bit more the English were doing, and certainly the Spanish and other parts of the world, but not, of course, in New England. Although when you go down to Florida, there's definitely Spanish influence, but I understand that, I know I'm starting slowly today, but I know that Florida is not in New England. I just know it's farther east than Texas. We've all seen the map. We know where it is. All right. So the English government, and who was that guy, Peter Stuyvesant, who I'm sure did not say his name with that accent, was one of the major citizens of New Amsterdam. And he said, we got a really good thing going here, but these British folks, they're kind of militaristic. They're going to take us over unless we build up kind of a little citizen army so we can protect ourselves. And the rest of the people went, you know what? No, we're busy. We're making money. We really don't care. So they didn't, and they got taken over. And then they made kind of an agreement, I suppose, with the British, and that some of the Dutch traditions would continue in the governance, and of course the Dutch could still make money, which was their main thing. But it is really easy to take over a colony that's undefended. It's like, there's no military, I'll just take it. Yeah. All right. So the Dutch had the largest share of non-English trade in the Americas. So the English crown, the government really was intent on wrestling away some of that control. And Dutch colonists, well, they're Dutch, but now they're under the control of the English, will still be able to make a decent living. So they're okay with it, and they get to have a little self-governance, but that's going to be sort of an odd place for a while. And one of the things that you'll notice is that tradition of money exchanging and trade and that kind of thing continues in New York. I mean, it's still where Wall Street is, and it's really seen as kind of an international center for variety. So that had been true since its inception as a Dutch colony and continues in some ways to this. Carolinas, the book talks a lot about the Carolinas, probably more than I'm going to, and it's not because they aren't important. I'm sorry. If you're from there, I don't mean to slight your place. Now, initially, it's the Carolinas rather than North and South. They'll do that a little bit later. And they're called Carolinas. They're named after King Charles. And you're going like, no, they're not. Yes, they are. Just trust me on this. Apparently his, I guess, Latin derivative of his name is Carolingus. So they call it the Carolinas after King Charles. I'm sorry, someone keeps calling me, so I'm going to turn my phone over. This is a plantation colony at first with the head right system, but they can't get people to move over. It's sort of like the Virginia had been, where if you come over, if you pay a fee, you'll get a small amount of land, but the more servants or slaves you bring with you, the more land you'll get. And people would rather move to Virginia and Maryland because there are more people there, it was more settled, the temperature was better, there weren't as many swampy areas and stuff. But you could grow interesting things in the Carolinas in addition to, you could still grow some tobacco, but indigo and rice, and they also raised cattle there. Indigo is a dye, so it's that kind of purplish blue sort of thing, which was super trendy during that time period, perhaps still is, what do I know? But nobody really wanted to move there. They couldn't really draw people over there. So what they ended up doing is the second, third, fourth sons from the Caribbean or Caribbean, however you like to say that, plantation owners moved up to the Carolinas, which is part of the reason you see a tradition of slavery from their earliest days. So it's not that they start off with indentured servants and then slaves come over. Also, part of the reason that they are having more trouble getting people to come to the Carolinas is enough people have come to the Americas that it's kind of relieved that whole excess population thing briefly. Plus, the government's a little more stable in England. Not that it had been unstable, but there have been feuding factions within the government, and all of the, shall we persecute the former Catholics or shall we persecute the Puritans, that sort of thing, kind of calmed down. So the reasons to come over were declining, but not in the Caribbean or Caribbean, where if your dad was the big plantation owner and had a lot of money, but also had more than one kid, you're not getting squat. So he'll give you some cash, you come up to the Carolinas and he'll give you some cash and some slaves, and then you'll start a colony there. As you can imagine, this is not going to be one of those colonies where there's really even economic development and a lot of families come and there's schools and community and that sort of, no. Okay. The Quaker colony is going to be a little different. That would be Pennsylvania. It's founded by William Penn and his group, the Quakers. If you know anything about the Quakers, you love them, because why not? I always tell students they're like the Buddhists of Christianity. They're like super, we love everyone, we're pacifist, we believe God talks to everyone, whether you can read the Bible or not. Every person has an inner light, so they're not as, they definitely don't believe in predestination, and they don't believe in original sin. Original sin. Yeah. Original sin's the idea that everybody's born with a sinful nature and therefore needs to be redeemed. So you have to find salvation. The Quakers kind of believe that salvation already exists within you. You just have to kind of recognize it, if that makes any sense. And that God can talk to you whether you have a Bible with you or not, and that God speaks to you through the inner light, which could be, I guess, interpreted as a conscience or a soul, if you like. Yeah. Okay. All right. This was seen as a cult, not even going to lie to you, not even going to pretend. And it was not, this is a really small group of folks, was seen as a cult, not very popular back in England. So William Penn's family was pretty well off. Had loaned money to the royal family, which happens from time to time, in that era. And the Penn family was just like, this William, he's embarrassing us. Let's get him out of here. So they ended up sending him to the Americas and giving him a colony to run. And because he was like super fair and really didn't want to go and collect money, the rent, because you had to pay a certain fee, I guess you're renting a colony essentially. You had to pay money to the government. If you had a colony, it's essentially taxes. So William Penn wasn't good about collecting that money. So eventually he got put in jail because he didn't pay the taxes on the colony. But he didn't collect the taxes on the colony. The colony was very successful, very prosperous. So they were really open to anybody coming over because they thought everybody had the inner light. So why prohibit anybody? And if you're looking for people that think everyone is equal, this is your group right here. I mean, if you believe God exists in every human being, then you're not going to discriminate against men or women, black or white, whatever ethnicity, race. And they also believe that children could get a vision or a word, not really a vision like, oh, I saw something, but, words from God as easily as adults. So they didn't necessarily have a formal minister for their churches. They would come in like, well, what has God said to you? Has God given anybody a message today? And if it was a kid or a former slave or Native American, whatever the message was, they truly believed God could speak through anyone at any time. So in that way, it's like a kinder, gentler hugging sort of colony, although they didn't really hug that much. And they dressed the way that you think Puritans dressed, very simply with the black and white sort of thing, because they really thought your life was supposed to be simple and you were supposed to live frugally and you're supposed to share and that sort of thing. They also would not take the land from natives if the natives didn't want them to be there, and they would pay them if they wanted to be paid. Although you guys wrote about how natives viewed land ownership. Now that is probably going to change over time a little bit because a bunch of people who see land ownership as in a different way and land needs to be purchased have kind of taken over. So it is, a little different. And Pennsylvania has people, it's the most diverse colony in that era. So it has people from all over the world. And I know I had just said that New Amsterdam, which becomes New York, was pretty diverse in some ways, but that's primarily like some Dutch folks and some English folks. In Pennsylvania, you have a whole bunch of Germans, you've got English, you've got Irish, you'll have former slaves. And you'll have a pretty good mix of cities. Philadelphia is the biggest one during that era, but there'll be some larger cities and farms. And Western Pennsylvania will be more farms, and that's where you see more of the Germans go. And then the cities are pretty diverse, though, as well. different businesses owned by people from different backgrounds. A lot of freed slaves, that sort of stuff. So pretty diverse. It's not very prosperous for William Penn, who ends up going to jail, and I think he dies in prison. I don't remember for certain. And his family's not going to get him out because he's kind of an embarrassment to them. But the colony becomes very diverse, very prosperous. So I think probably second to Massachusetts, Connecticut, the Puritan colonies, you've got a pretty even economic development and pretty good opportunities for a variety of different people. All right, we're getting into something that's going to help you perhaps answer the weekly question. All right, so your book, again, does such a nice job of having the little subject headings, and it'll help you as you progress through to answer the question about how slavery replaces indentured servitude. So be sure and look for those subject headings as well. But the reason that happens is for a couple of reasons. For a variety of reasons, mostly racist. Slavery is perpetual for African slaves. So throughout the history of slavery, which I always assume you talk about a little bit in world history, usually people are enslaved because of debt or because they're captives. You know, you have a war with somebody and you capture their people, so they're enslaved. And usually slavery is just until the debt is paid or it's for a generation, but usually you don't own the children of slaves. But in the Americas, mostly because of the distance from Africa for the slaves, and for some racial reasons as well, and they'll justify this through religious reasons as well. Slavery is going to become a perpetual status for people of African descent. So that meant that if you had female slaves, it was beneficial for you if they had a lot of children because you owned those children as well. And that explains a lot of the mixed race slaves because it was very common and seen as a good economic practice for slaves to rape, or for slave owners to rape their female slaves so that they would have more children. So it starts, fairly heinous fairly heinous custom. I don't know that custom's the right word. I'm not sure I can think of the right word, but it's certainly tragic idea that it's okay to rape your slaves. So they did, and there's more slaves. Also, because slavery is the way that slavery is conducted in North America versus Central America or the Caribbean, where they're growing sugar and coffee and things like that. Most of the slaves who go to the more Caribbean or South American places, they're primarily men, and their life expectancy is very short because the goal is really to work the slave as hard as possible. And if he dies, he dies. You'll just go buy another one. So life expectancy in the Sugar Islands and in South America is very short. And also there's not a family life. There's, essentially a 24-hour work cycle with things like sugar, because you grow it, you process it, you do a lot of stuff to sugar, and the growing season is year round. In tobacco growing, or eventually in cotton growing, it's more seasonal and more of a long-term investment. So you want your slave to also be a long-term investment. So people wanted their slaves to live longer, and they also sold slaves to different regions for different reasons. So the prices of slaves who were sold to North America, the slaves were more expensive. So they saw them as a different sort of investment. Now, I am not suggesting that slaves in North America were treated better than other slaves. I have no way to assess that, because the idea that you are owned by somebody, can get raped by somebody, your children belong to somebody. I don't know how we can look at that situation and say like, oh, it wasn't so bad because they lived a pretty long time. It's like, no, that may just extend the torture for longer. I have no idea, how a good way to assess that is, but it probably is at least okay historically to note that the type of life that slaves live is dramatically different in North America and South America. But in the initial days, there were ways for people to buy their way out of slavery, work their way out of slavery, that sort of thing. And you've got slaves mixed in with indentured servants especially in Virginia in the 1600s, the mid to late 1600s. Now, you may remember that indentured servants were supposed to get some money or a piece of land at the end of their servitude. And once that happened, then they would go live their own lives, perhaps marry if they could find a former female indentured, not a former female, but a former indentured servant who was female, and start their own lives and families and that sort of thing. And while it wasn't necessarily a healthy existence for them, it gave opportunities to the next generation. And of course, former slaves could do the same thing and own property, and in some instances have voting rights, that sort of thing, if they owned property. Now, because Virginia is not that big, I know it's kind of big for East Coast states, but not that big, and most of the good land had been kind of taken up, most indentured servants were either getting a really crappy piece of land or they were not getting enough money to buy land in Virginia. So they felt like their rights, if they had rights, which weren't certainly observed during their period of indentured servitude, but they felt like their post-indentured servitude rights were being infringed and their economic opportunities were being infringed. And also their governor, William Berkeley, had decided that we'll have a let's not fight with the natives policy because they had lived in an era of virtual peace for a few years, decade or so. And people were prosperous and they just kind of wanted to leave it alone. It seemed to be going well for wealthier people in the colony. Now, if you didn't own land, another way that you could become wealthy was through fur, or at least prosperous. I don't know that wealthy is the right word, but prosperous. You could get a fur trading license, but only the governor could assign the fur trading licenses. And if you gave too many, then there wouldn't be enough whatever animal you were hunting to get their fur, so that it would no longer be a lucrative business. So they were really trying to limit the number of people who got the fur trading licenses. So not everyone who applied got them. And of course, it kind of went down to who do you know? What are your connections? Sort of, the politics of daily life, colonial version. So this fellow, Nathaniel Bacon, who was fairly well off, owned some land, but wanted to make some more money, applied for a fur trading license and got rejected. And he wrote a petition to the governor and said, you are restricting the rights of small landowners and you're not allowing us to become wealthy by restricting the fur trading licenses. And he got, I think it was 12 people to sign his protest along with him. And he said, you know what, we're just going to go take land from Native Americans because you're not really protecting us anyway. And they're invading some of our territory, what could be our territory. So we're going to go and fight the Native Americans because you won't do it for us. And part of the reason Berkeley said he didn't want to do it is because, the relative peace and prosperity they were enjoying. However, this socioeconomic group did not feel that they were enjoying that prosperity. So they said, we're going to go take on the Native Americans. We don't care if you think it's okay or not, and we're going to go get our land. Well, they caused some stink, as you might imagine. They upset the Native Americans. They also, as an act of protest, burned down Jamestown. My goodness, that's, yeah. So Bacon leads the protests against the colonial governor. William Berkeley. And what eventually happens is the colonial government, with an assist from the British, put down the rebellion. Part of the reason the rebellion falls apart too is that Bacon falls apart. He gets sick, develops a disease called dysentery, and he dies. And dysentery probably shared from some of the swampy stuff that goes on in Virginia, and probably spread by mosquitoes. But dysentery, if you get this, sometimes you can get it from drinking bad water as well. You I don't know of a good way to say this. You mostly just throw up and have diarrhea until you get dehydrated and die. So it's a bacterial infection in your colon, and you're gonna, in that era, you're gonna die. Modern era, if you have that kind of infection, if they catch it early enough, they can probably get you well. If they can't, you're still gonna die. It's a bad disease. So he pukes and has diarrhea long enough that he dies. And then his followers, don't manage things very well. And then certainly the 12 people who signed the petition with him, along with other rebels, once the colony gets them under control, are hanged. So they execute them. So they form a militia, burn down Jamestown, then Bacon dies, then the leaders get caught and they get executed. Many of these rebels were former indentured servants, and the way that the colony reacts to this is they don't necessarily ban indentured servants, but certainly people who are large landowners take notice of this. And if you bring over people who can gain some freedom and then gain land and then become your economic competitor, and maybe get control in government eventually, then you may have created a problem that you don't want to have. So they decide, formally, informally, both, that they're going to shift away from using indentured servants. Also, because you're seeing so many more slaves come up through the Caribbean, especially to the Carolinas, but they can also come to Virginia. And I'm not going to suggest to you that they weren't using African slavery in Virginia, because you know that they were. It was just a smaller percentage of the labor, slavery or indentured servitude. They used more indentured servants at first, but because the risk and the supply of indentured servants, risk was increasing, supply decreasing, you start to see the change in Virginia, Maryland as well, away from indentured servitude and toward the use of slaves. And that's in large part because of what happens in Bacon's Rebellion, but it's also a problem. It happens because of Bacon's Rebellion, but it also becomes an issue of the availability of indentured servitude and the use, what they saw as investment of perpetual slavery. So, and again, I'm not ever going to suggest to you that slavery is an investment, but I'm telling you that that's the way that they saw it. All right. Let me pause for just a second because I kind of went on there, didn't I? All right. Just going to check in to see if you guys have any questions, if there's anything you want to ask related to the subject matter at this moment. And also, I got distracted because the trash guys came. That's what it was. The trash. But I need a drink of water too. All right. Is there anything you guys want to ask? Everything's going well. I'm looking at your pictures. Somebody's having, looks like tacos. All right. All right, we'll go back to the screen sharing then, since apparently I figured out how to do it since I forgot over the weekend. Goodness. All right. King Philip's War, and your book talks about King Philip's War, but I did not, did I? And I don't know that I want to get into a whole, well, King Philip is Metacomet. So King Philip is the British name for a Native American leader who has figured out that it's not cool that a bunch of white people have moved, a bunch of British people have moved in and started taking over the land and changing customs and that sort of thing. So his concern is that his tribe has become more dependent upon the British for trade, for all sorts of things, for culture, that it's changing them, it's changing who they are, it's changing what control they have in their region. So the goal is really to push English settlers out, either, to push them somewhere else or to kill them. So it's a short-lived war, but it's a pretty violent thing. Bacon's Rebellion, also, not super long either, about a year, but it's problematic, and it's at the same time. And there's a Protestant uprising in Maryland, which changes who gets to vote, that sort of thing, because Maryland, you remember, they had some trouble getting people to come over to colonize, and they started as a Catholic colony, but there weren't enough Catholics who wanted to come over, so they let over Protestants, and then Protestants outnumbered the Catholics. And so briefly, the Protestants will kind of take over Maryland, and they'll make it illegal for you to vote or hold office if you're Catholic, which sort of defeated the original purpose of Maryland, but it'll revert back later. And it is a revolt regarding voting rights for smaller landowners as well. Certainly they had a head right system, and they really wanted to be a feudal colony the same way the Carolinas wanted to be, where the large landowners ran everything, and it was like the feudal feudal period in England, where you had these small sort of city states, and the large landowner was your protector, so you paid him rent, but he was like the police force and took care of you and all that sort of thing. That typically, it's not going to work any better in Maryland than it did historically. And the Pueblo Revolt, your book talks quite a bit about this, happens in where the Pueblos are. So it needs to happen not in New England, right? So New Mexico, what becomes New Mexico? Sorry for you all. But this is a Pueblo Revolt is a pushback against Spanish rule in a pretty important trade region in New Mexico, where the natives were resistant to a couple of things, mostly Spanish control of their trade, but also they weren't super thrilled about that push that, or that the requirement that the Spanish would have that said you had to be Catholic. So, natives weren't Catholic, so they weren't super excited about that. So, and there was an uprising, I'd read about this, your book doesn't talk about this, in another source, that happened before 1680 that was suppressed really harshly by the Spanish government, where they mutilated a lot of the men who participated in the revolt. They cut off part of their toes, and that made it hard for them to run, to walk around, that sort of stuff. And the thought was, if they did that, they wouldn't rebel again. But it caused a different sort of rebellion about a generation later. So the goal was to cast off some of that Spanish control in that region. And their leader was a Native American whose nickname is El Pope. And so he leads the rebellion and pushes the Spanish control out. And then they negotiate a mutually beneficial trading agreement. And of course, you don't have to be Catholic. And if you know very much about Spanish colonization, which I assume you do because of where you're from, you know that the Spanish didn't bring over families. And when they colonized, they controlled large areas, but they didn't have a lot of people there. So if your area was pretty remote and there weren't a lot of Spanish colonials there, you're probably going to do whatever you want and as long as the Spanish trade with you and you're both happy about it, it's probably going to work out. So the Spanish would technically have control of the land, but they probably didn't have as much control of your daily lives because the Spanish colonial presence wasn't as large. And that's going to become true in the English colonies as well as time goes along and the colonies spread. We also, I'm sorry, I'm scrolling down while I'm talking to you. We need to talk about something called salutary neglect. So I'm sort of scrolling to see, okay, we'll probably save that for next time because I don't want to, I want to give you a reason to come back, talk about salutary neglect. But notice that you're having a whole lot of colonial unrest at the same time. And part of that is because the European control is declining and the populations of Europeans in these colonies, who maybe now at this point are born in these colonies, these guys feel like they should have more rights and more control of their colony. And they don't agree with that philosophy of mercantilism, which is kind of how we started the day out, which said that the colony should be run for the benefit of the mother country, not the people who live in the colony. Because these people, whether, briefly we're talking about a Spanish colony, but mostly we're talking about the English, these folks believe that they are citizens of England and that they have the rights of citizens and they should get a measure of control in how their government is run. Now, if you're wondering, did people in England feel that way? Rich people did. Poor people knew they didn't have any rights or control. They understood that, but rich people felt that way. And these guys are essentially rich people. They are large landowners. They're definitely more wealthy than they could have ever been back in England because there's no land available. So you've created this class of really well-off folks who want to have lots of economic and political rights. And then as the government in England changes how they look at these colonists, they'll see them truly as colonists, not as English citizens. It's going to start to create some conflict, which is going to be a problem. And it makes what becomes the American Revolution a little different than other revolutions because typically revolutions are run by poor people who feel oppressed and don't have stuff and don't see opportunities. The American Revolution is really going to be started by folks who are pretty well off, more well off than the average person in their home country, which is not a place they live or were born, but they see England as their home country. But they want to continue to have the control that they had before the English start to take some of that control away. So U.S. Revolution, American Revolution, it's kind of different, isn't it? All right. So political and social unrest in this era and area, as we see from Bacon's Rebellion, King Philip's War, Pueblo Revolt, or Pope's Rebellion. What's going on back in England is James II replaces Charles. And from your study of English history that there's like Catholic and Protestant folks in the royal family. So James II's more of the Catholic folk. So they thought, well, my goodness, he's going to go back to Catholicism. We're not going to be as unified. And he does take away some of the voice of the people in the colonies by creating something called the Dominion of New England, which we'll start with next time as well and talk a little bit more about. But this is a colonial government that's set up by the British. So the British appoint governors and assemblies rather than allowing the people in the colonies to vote. That's going to become a problem. And their colonial governor of the entire Dominion is this guy, Edmund Andros, which I know it looks like Andros, but for whatever reason they say it Andrews. But Edmund Andros becomes the governor of the Dominion of New England, and people just hate that. And he is probably a little oppressive, but they're also just not used to having an unelected person telling them what to do. So they're going to push back against that authority. Now, a very few years later, William and Mary ascend to the throne in the Glorious Revolution, and James gets banished. I don't know if banished is the right word, that's sent to Scotland, I think it is. So this is a bloodless coup. They don't, William and Mary are married and they represent different factions of a group of royal families. So part of the reason that people support their ascension to the throne is that they will agree to go back to letting people have more voice in their government. So people support their ascension to the throne. Without that support, they wouldn't have been able to take over. So they are going to share power, establish the English Bill of Rights, English Toleration Act, and that leads to the dissolution of the Dominion of New England. Some weird thing happens in New York, which we'll talk about next time because we need more time to talk about the weird thing in New York, and then freer worship within the Americas. So this will be, you have that brief period of these revolutions, and this will be kind of the move back to that thing that we're going to talk about next time called salutary neglect. All right, I'm sure it's long past the time where I should be talking to you. It isn't really, but I know some of you are going like, oh my gosh, she's still talking. Yes, I'm sorry. All right, so I'm going to stop for the day, but do you guys have any questions you want to ask before we go? And don't completely go because I just want to double check the roll, which I think I got mostly, maybe. Yeah, I'm looking to see. It looks like maybe one of you is not here, but I'll double check in a sec. Let me stop the recording.